In the quiet corners of American history, where the official record gives way to whispers and bleached bone, there are stories that cling to the land itself. These are not tales of grand battles or noble pioneers, but of a darkness that found purchase in the vast, unforgiving spaces where civilization was just a rumor. The account of the O'Hara sisters is one such story, a piece of American Gothic horror rooted not in haunted New England manners, but in the shimmering heat and profound emptiness of the Nevada desert. It is a chronicle of whiskey and murder, of a meticulously constructed facade that concealed a cold and patient depravity, proving that the most monstrous designs can be built, brick by brick, under an open and indifferent sky. If the unmarked graves of the past call for their stories to be told, and you have just found your way to this archive, consider subscribing to ensure you are present as we unseal each new file and follow its threads to their grim conclusion. The year was 1872, and the place was a wound in the earth called Red Hollow. It was not a town in any formal sense, but a waypoint, a collection of sun-scoured structures clinging to life beside a freight trail that stitched the scattered mining camps of the Nevada high desert together. Red Hollow existed because of thirst, exhaustion, and the simple need for a place to rest a team of mules before pushing onward into a landscape that seemed actively hostile to human endeavor. The air itself was an abrasive presence, thick with alkali dust that coated every surface in a fine, pale grit. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down from a seamless, bleached blue sky, leaching the color from the wooden facades of the livery, the general store, and the cluster of canvas and plank lean-tos that housed a handful of permanent residents. Heat shimmered in visible waves above the caliche soil, distorting the horizon and making the distant, brown mountains tremble as if in a fever dream. This was a place defined by what it was not. It was not connected by rail. It was not regularly served by the law, and it was not a destination. It was a pause, a brief interruption in an overwhelming emptiness. Into this landscape of stark survival arrived the O'Hara sisters, Bridget and Nuala. They did not limp into Red Hollow on a half-dead horse or with the weary desperation of most new arrivals. They came on the morning stage from Virginia City, a proper coach that seemed an extravagance in this part of the territory. They stepped out into the blinding glare, two figures of startling contrast to their surroundings. They were dressed in dark, well-made traveling clothes, their skirts showing no trace of the fine dust that seemed to permeate the very air. Bridget, the elder, possessed a direct and assessing gaze, her movements economical and precise. It was she who conducted their business, speaking to the livery owner and the proprietor of the store in a clear, steady voice that carried no hint of uncertainty. Nuala was quieter, her attention seeming to drift over the ramshackle settlement, taking in the details of its construction, the flow of the hot wind around the corners of the buildings, the quality of the silence that lay beneath the creak of a weather vane. They moved with a shared purpose that was both unspoken and absolute, a closed circuit of intent that left no room for outsiders. They carried with them a heavy strongbox, and more importantly, a palpable sense of a plan already set in motion. They were not seeking fortune, they had brought it with them, and they intended to plant it here, in this forgotten corner of the desert. Their object of interest was a defunct roadhouse at the northern edge of the settlement. It was a two-story casualty of a failed mining venture, its windows boarded over, and its sign swinging from a single hinge, the name long since scoured away by sun and sand. The place was a carcass, yet the sisters inspected it with the meticulous attention of architects. They walked the perimeter, Nuala running a hand over the sun-cracked adobe of the foundation while Bridget peered through a gap in the boards, her eyes adjusting to the gloom within. They did not haggle over the price. The owner, a man eager to be rid of the derelict property, found the transaction unsettlingly swift. Bridget produced the payment in clean banknotes. The transaction concluded with a firm handshake that left no room for further discussion. Within a week, a wagon arrived, not with household goods, but with tools, lumber, and hired laborers from a settlement 2 days' ride to the east. The sisters did not intend to simply occupy the building. They intended to remake it. They posted a new, freshly painted sign above the door, its gold lettering gleaming in the harsh light. It read, "The Golden Kiln." The work that began on the roadhouse became a source of quiet speculation among the handful of residents in Red Hollow. Otto Weiss, a freighter whose route passed through the settlement every 3 weeks, was one of the first to notice the strangeness of the construction. He had seen countless roadhouses and saloons thrown up across the territory, flimsy affairs of plank and canvas designed for quick profit and little else. The Golden Kiln was different. The O'Hara sisters directed the laborers with an unyielding specificity that seemed entirely out of place. The existing adobe walls were not merely patched, they were reinforced, thickened to a depth of nearly 3 feet. The workers were instructed to mix the new adobe with a binder that gave it an almost stone-like density. From the outside, it looked solid, a bastion against the elements. From the inside, it would have felt like a fortress, the thick walls swallowing sound and insulating the interior not just from the oppressive heat, but from the outside world itself. Otto, sitting atop his freight wagon and watching the work progress, remarked to the blacksmith that they were building it like a county jail, not a public house. The blacksmith, a man of few words, simply nodded, the rhythmic clang of his hammer the only reply. Even more peculiar was the excavation of the cellar. The ground beneath Red Hollow was an unforgiving layer of calichet, a natural cement of gravel and sand bonded by calcium carbonate that was notoriously difficult to work. Most structures had no cellar at all, or at best a shallow pit for storing root vegetables. The sisters, however, insisted on a deep, fully excavated cellar. The work was slow and punishing, the sound of pickaxes striking the hardpan ringing out from dawn until dusk. The laborers, paid a generous wage that discouraged questions, hauled out basket after basket of the concrete-like soil. Nuala oversaw this part of the project with a singular focus, often descending into the growing pit with a lantern to inspect the progress, ensuring the walls were smooth and the floor was level. The stated purpose was the storage of whiskey and beer at a consistent, cool temperature, a luxury that would surely attract discerning customers. But the sheer scale of the cellar seemed excessive, a cavernous space burrowed into the earth far beyond what would be required for even the most ambitious inventory of spirits. It was a cold, dark, silent void being carved out directly beneath the future saloon. The final and most perplexing feature was the construction of a specific room at the rear of the building on the ground floor. This room, one of several intended for overnight guests, was built differently from the others. It shared the same thick adobe outer wall, but its interior walls were also reinforced. A heavy, solid wood door was fitted with an expensive, robust lock, the kind one might see on a bank vault or a land office strong room. Most notably, the room had no windows, while the other guest rooms featured small shuttered openings to allow for a breeze. This one was a sealed chamber. It was situated at the very back of the roadhouse, its rear wall facing out toward a dry wash that snaked its way into the desert. Bridget herself supervised the placement of every timber and the fitting of every joint in that room, her expression unreadable. She possessed a disarming pleasantness when dealing with the townsfolk, once stopping to admire the storekeeper's small collection of desert flowers and recalling a similar bloom from her childhood. It was a brief, humanizing detail, a fleeting glimpse of a past that seemed disconnected from her current, relentless focus. This momentary softness made her meticulous oversight of the windowless, fortified room all the more unnerving. The context of the territory made such a project both more audacious and more possible. The arm of the law was long, but its grasp was thin in these remote stretches of Nevada. The county seat was a 3-day ride away, and its authority was represented locally by Sheriff Calvin Pike. He was a man well into his middle years, more concerned with maintaining a quiet equilibrium than with strict enforcement of territorial statutes. He saw the O'Hara sisters and their substantial investment as a net positive for Red Hollow. A high-quality establishment like the Golden Kiln would bring in more traffic, more money, and a touch of refinement to a place that had none. He paid the sisters a courtesy call shortly after their arrival, tipping his hat and offering the assistance of his office, an office that consisted of himself and a single, earnest deputy. Bridget received him with polite deference, offering him a cool glass of water and assuring him that their only aim was to run a respectable and orderly house. The sheriff left satisfied, convinced that the sisters were a civilizing influence. This sentiment was echoed, albeit more piously, by Reverend Malachi Doone. The Reverend was an itinerant preacher, a man whose faith was as weathered and resilient as the desert itself. He saw the squalor and vice of the way stations as a spiritual blight and held services in a tent whenever he passed through Red Hollow. He was initially wary of the new establishment, expecting another den of gambling and cheap whiskey, but Bridget sought him out, speaking of her desire to provide a place where a weary traveler could find not just a drink, but a decent meal and a clean bed. She spoke of decorum and standards, and she made a generous donation to his modest ministry. The Reverend, too, was won over. He saw in the O'Hara sisters 2 devout and enterprising women bringing a touch of order to the chaos of the frontier. He began to speak of the Golden Kiln as a potential cornerstone of a real community, a place of light in the godless dark. By late autumn of 1872, the work was complete. The Golden Kiln stood as if it had been transported from a more established city and set down in the middle of the desert. Its paint was fresh, its windows were clean, and its brass fixtures gleamed. At dusk, the warm yellow light of oil lamps would pool from its windows, casting long, inviting rectangles onto the blowing sand. To a traveler emerging from the vast, dark expanse of the desert, it would have seemed a miraculous beacon of warmth and safety. The heavy front doors opened into a saloon that was unlike any other for 100 miles in any direction. It featured a long, polished bar of dark wood, a collection of sturdy tables and chairs, and a floor that was swept clean. The air was free of the usual frontier saloon stench of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Bridget presided over the front room, her smile welcoming and her memory for names and drinks unerring. Nuala remained in the background, managing the kitchen, the rooms upstairs, and the unseen depths of the cellar. The polished surface was perfect, a testament to hard work and refined taste. Yet, the feeling of solidity, of fortification, remained. The thick walls seemed to absorb the boisterous laughter of the patrons, containing it. The cellar door, visible behind the bar, was built of reinforced oak with heavy iron hinges. And somewhere at the back of the building, behind a corridor and another locked door, sat the silent, windowless room, waiting. The core question hung in the dry desert air, unspoken but potent. It was not a question of whether the sisters would succeed in their business venture, but rather what business they were truly in, and why its proper execution required a foundation of such impenetrable, calculated strength. The Golden Kiln was open, its light a stark contrast to the immense darkness of the surrounding desert, a desert that had long proven its capacity for keeping secrets. The Golden Kiln did not simply open, it bloomed. an unnatural flower of civilization in the harsh, cracked soil of the desert. In the months that followed its completion, it became the undisputed heart of Red Hollow, a gravitational center for every soul moving along the dusty freight trail. The light from its windows was a promise, and the sounds from within were a siren song of warmth, company, and oblivion. On any given evening, the main room was a tableau of the territory's disparate souls. Fiddle music, supplied by a traveling musician who found the pay and board too good to leave, sawed through the thick air, a frantic, cheerful sound that was half drowned by the percussive rhythm of laughter and the constant, gentle clatter of heavy glass on wood. The air was a rich stew of scents, the sharp, sweet smell of spilled whiskey, the mineral tang of pipe smoke, the savory aroma of roasting meat from Nuala's kitchen, and the underlying, ever-present scent of dry dust and sweating men. It was a picture of boisterous, chaotic life, and at its center, orchestrating it all with an almost supernatural calm, was Bridget O'Hara. Bridget was the establishment's public face, its soul and its memory. She moved through the crowded room not as a mere proprietor, but as a confidant and a confessor. She possessed a remarkable talent for recollection, remembering not only a man's name after a single meeting, but also his preferred drink, the name of his hometown, and the small, boastful details of his life he had shared on a previous visit. She would inquire after a miner's new claim or a teamster's difficult journey, her interest seeming so genuine, so specific, that men felt seen and valued in a way that was rare in their transient, often brutal lives. Her charm was not flamboyant. It was a quiet, steady warmth that drew people in. She listened more than she spoke, her gaze attentive, her questions precise. She was a master of conversation, guiding it effortlessly, extracting information like a skilled assayer sampling ore. A man's casual mention of a payroll he was carrying, a lone prospector's boast of a lucky strike, a land surveyor's complaint about the weight of his instruments, all of it was noted, cataloged, and stored behind her serene and thoughtful expression. She ran the room with the efficiency of a field general, yet with the grace of a society hostess. While Bridget was the sun, warming the patrons, Nuala was the silent, unseen mechanism that made the whole system turn. She rarely set foot in the main saloon during operating hours. Her domain was the world behind the public-facing bar, the meticulously organized kitchen, the clean and orderly upstairs guest rooms, the storerooms, and, most importantly, the vast, cool cellar. Nuala was a creature of ledgers and logistics. While Bridget cultivated men, Nuala managed inventory. She moved with a soft-footed silence that was almost unnerving, a stark contrast to the saloon's noisy chaos. Mireille Voss, a seamstress who rented a room on the second floor on a long-term basis, would sometimes catch glimpses of the younger sister in the hallways late at night. Mireille worked on commission for the wives of mining superintendents in the more established camps, and her quiet, solitary life made her an astute observer. She noted that Nuala seemed to glide rather than walk, her focus always inward, her hands never idle. She might be carrying a stack of fresh linens, a tray of polished glasses, or a heavy, leather-bound ledger. She was the house's silent editor, ensuring every detail was perfect, every contingency planned for. It was Mireille who first felt a flicker of unease, a sense that the sisters' operation was more complex than it appeared. Her room was at the front of the house, overlooking the main trail. But one evening, while mending a tear in a dress by the dim light of her lamp, she heard the soft but distinct sound of the heavy cellar door being unbolted, long after the last patron had stumbled out into the night. Curiosity got the better of her, and she crept to the top of the main stairs, peering down into the darkened saloon. A single lantern burned behind the bar, casting long, dancing shadows. In its glow, she saw Nuala, her back to the stairs, working at a small, secluded section of the bar. On the wood before her were several top-shelf whiskey bottles, the kind reserved for wealthy patrons, along with a collection of smaller, unlabeled dark glass vials. Nuala worked with the precision of an apothecary, using a glass pipette to transfer a few drops of a thick, dark liquid from a vial into one of the whiskey bottles. She then carefully resealed the bottle with fresh wax, her movements deft and practiced. After treating 3 such bottles, she returned them to a specific, locked cabinet behind the bar, extinguished her lantern, and disappeared back into the rear of the building. The act was quiet, clinical, and utterly divorced from the simple business of selling spirits. The rumor of doctored drinks was an old one on the frontier, a common fear for any man carrying a substantial sum, but it was usually associated with rot-gut saloons and back-alley card games. The Golden Kiln was the antithesis of such places. It was respectable, clean, and by all accounts, honest. Yet, here was evidence of a hidden practice, a chemical intervention in the very product that was making the sisters' reputation. The substance was laudanum, a tincture of opium readily available and commonly used for a host of ailments. In small doses, it was a painkiller and a sedative. In larger, carefully measured amounts, it could induce a profound stupor, a state of helpless disorientation that left a man conscious but utterly pliable, his memory of events clouded and fragmented. The whiskey in these specific bottles was not meant to be merely intoxicating. It was engineered to be a key, one designed to unlock a man's defenses and open the door to his possessions. This chemical advantage was deployed against a very specific and evolving clientele. In its first months, the Golden Kiln served the men who had always been in Red Hollow, dusty freighters like Otto Weiss, small-time prospectors, and the occasional lost traveler. They were men of little means, and while their coin was welcome, they were not the establishment's ultimate purpose. They were the foundation, the backdrop of authenticity against which a more lucrative trade could be conducted. As word of the kiln's quality spread, the nature of its patrons began to shift. Men of capital began to make it a planned stop. Mining investors on their way to assess new claims, railroad surveyors with company funds, and cattle buyers with thick rolls of cash started to frequent the polished bar. With them came the predators that follow money. One such man was Thorne Malloy, a gambler whose trade was cards, but whose real skill was in reading people. He was handsome, well-dressed, and his hands moved with a fluid, mesmerizing grace, whether he was shuffling a deck or lighting a cigar. He recognized in Bridget a fellow artist of human assessment, though he could not begin to guess at the depths of her craft. He told her once, in a moment of professional admiration, that she could strip a man of his last dollar with nothing more than a sympathetic ear. Bridget had simply smiled and refilled his glass, her expression betraying nothing. The local figures of authority, who might have posed a threat to such a calculated operation, were instead transformed into assets. Sheriff Calvin Pike, a man whose primary motivation was the avoidance of trouble, found the O'Hara sisters to be model citizens. The Golden Kiln had, as he had hoped, brought more commerce to Red Hollow. It had also reduced the number of brawls and petty crimes that he had to deal with. The sisters maintained a strict but polite order. Bridget's monthly donation to a fund for civic improvement, a fund that existed only in her conversations with the sheriff, sealed the arrangement. The money was delivered in a discreet envelope, always in cash, and its acceptance ensured that the sheriff's already limited curiosity was directed anywhere but at the roadhouse. He would stop in for a drink from time to time, enjoying the deference Bridget showed him, and he would declare to anyone who would listen that the O'Hara sisters were a blessing for the territory. He saw a polished surface and chose not to look for what might lie beneath. Reverend Malachi Doon, in his own way, provided a similar, if unintentional, service. He remained a staunch defender of the sisters and their civilizing influence. He would often take his supper in the kiln's small dining area, a space kept separate from the more boisterous saloon. Bridget would join him, speaking of her plans to help fund a proper church in Red Hollow, a permanent structure of adobe and timber to replace his threadbare tent. She spoke the language of piety with a fluency that the Reverend found deeply moving. He saw her as an ally in his lonely battle against the wilderness's corrosive effect on the souls of men. His public praise for the sisters, delivered from his makeshift pulpit on Sunday mornings, became another layer of armor for their operation. He told his sparse congregation that the Golden Kiln was proof that commerce and Christian charity could walk hand in hand, a testament to the industry of two good women. He failed to notice that while Bridget was a pillar of decorum, some of the wealthiest travelers who sought shelter under her roof seemed to vanish from the trail, their journeys cut inexplicably short. The process of selection was a slow, patient hunt. A man like Seamus Kellett, a miner who had just sold his small claim for a modest but life-changing sum of gold dust, became a person of interest. He was loud and celebratory, buying rounds for the entire saloon and speaking too freely of his plans to return east and buy a farm. Bridget engaged him in conversation, her friendly inquiries drawing out the crucial details, that he was traveling alone, that no one knew his precise route, and that his family back east had not heard from him in years and did not expect to. He was, in the cold calculus of the sisters' enterprise, a man who would not be immediately missed. His lack of connections, his sudden wealth, and his solitary nature made him a perfect candidate. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned, Bridget invited him to sample a particularly fine, top-shelf whiskey, a special bottle she said she saved for momentous occasions. It was a gift, she explained, to celebrate his good fortune. As he drank, his boisterous energy slowly ebbed, replaced by a hazy, compliant confusion. The fiddle music swirled around him. The laughter of the few remaining patrons seemed to come from a great distance, and the warm, solicitous face of Bridget was the last clear thing he saw as she gently suggested that he must be tired and that she had a premium room at the rear of the building, a quiet, secure room where he could rest peacefully. As she led him away from the bar and down the back corridor, Nuala emerged from the shadows of the kitchen, her eyes meeting Bridget's for a fraction of a second. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The public-facing saloon continued its performance of cheer and camaraderie, the music playing on, while behind a softly clicking back door, a transaction of a much darker nature was being completed. The whiskey had done its work. A key had been turned. The premium guest rooms at the Golden Kiln were located in a quiet, single-story extension at the rear of the main building, set apart from the noise and revelry of the saloon. They were marketed as havens of privacy and comfort for the discerning traveler, and Bridget charged a correspondingly high price for their use. Each room was furnished with a heavy, dark wood bedstead, a washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a single, sturdy chair. The floors were covered with thick, woven rugs that muffled the sound of footsteps, and the air within was always cool and still, insulated from the desert heat by the formidable thickness of the adobe walls. But one of these rooms, the last one at the very end of the corridor, was different. It was the windowless chamber whose construction Otto Weiss had noted with such puzzlement. It was reserved for a very specific type of guest, the kind selected with meticulous care by Bridget from the bustling floor of the saloon. The room's most prominent feature was a massive freestanding wardrobe built of dark, polished oak. It was a handsome piece of furniture, its surface reflecting the flickering lantern light with a deep, liquid sheen. To any guest, it would have appeared as nothing more than a place to hang one's coat and traveling clothes. Its doors opened with a satisfying weight, revealing a cedar-lined interior. But this was a carefully constructed deception. The entire rear panel of the wardrobe was a disguised door. It was not hinged, but rather designed to pivot inward on a central, concealed pin, balanced and greased to move with an almost complete silence. A small, cunningly hidden latch, disguised as a knot in the wood grain on the interior side panel, was the only thing holding it in place. A person standing inside the wardrobe could release the latch with a simple press of the thumb, causing the false back to swing open into a darkness that felt colder and more absolute than the simple absence of light. It opened into the earth itself. Beyond the wardrobe lay a chamber, a man-made burrow carved from the dense caliche. It was not a cellar or a storeroom. It was a place of grim transition. The air within was heavy and close, carrying the damp, mineral scent of packed earth and the sharp, chemical tang of coal oil and lye. The space was just large enough for two people to stand comfortably, its walls smooth and hard, bearing the faint, rhythmic scars of the pickaxes that had carved it. The floor was the most critical element of its design. It was not level. It possessed a gentle but deliberate slope, a gradient so subtle it might not be noticed by a man in a state of disorientation, but significant enough to guide the flow of liquid or the movement of a heavy, inanimate object. The floor sloped downward, away from the wardrobe entrance, toward a small, grated opening at the base of the far wall. This opening, a dark, iron-clad rectangle, led directly into the deep, sandy bottom of the dry wash that ran behind the roadhouse. Set into the packed earth of one wall were two heavy, iron rings, their surfaces cold and slightly rusted, anchored deep within the adobe of the building's foundation. Their purpose was brutally self-evident. This was not a room, it was a piece of machinery, an abattoir designed for the clean and efficient processing of human life. Percival Hargreaves was the perfect subject for the machine's operation. He was a land buyer for the Central Pacific Railroad, a man of quiet importance and substantial means. He arrived at the Golden Kiln in the early winter of 1872, carrying a satchel containing survey maps, deeds, and a significant amount of company cash for land acquisitions. He was in his late 40s, a meticulous man who appreciated order and quiet. He found both at the sisters' establishment. He was impressed by Bridget's professionalism and the quality of her whiskey. He was traveling alone on a circuitous route through the territory, and he had informed his superiors that he would be out of contact for a period of several weeks. He spoke of this to Bridget, not as a complaint, but as a simple statement of fact, a detail of his solitary and important work. To Bridget, these were not details, they were qualifications. After 2 nights of quiet respectability, Bridget offered him a glass of her finest scotch, a gesture of appreciation, she said, for a man of his discerning taste. The laudanum was a ghost in the amber liquid, tasteless and odorless. Percival drank it, remarking on its exceptional smoothness. The effect was not immediate. It was a slow, creeping tide of confusion. The sharp edges of the world began to soften. The fiddle music from the saloon seemed to warp and bend, and the faces of the other patrons became indistinct blurs. He felt a profound weariness, a weight settling in his limbs. He tried to stand, but his legs felt disconnected from his will. Bridget was at his side instantly, her expression one of polite concern. She told him he appeared unwell, that the desert climate could be taxing. She insisted he allow her to help him to his room, the premium room she had saved for him, where he could rest without being disturbed, leaning heavily on her, his mind struggling to grasp the sequence of events. Percival allowed himself to be guided down the quiet rear corridor. He was vaguely aware of the heavy door clicking shut behind them, the sound swallowed by the thick walls. He registered the stifling silence of the windowless room. Bridget's voice was a soothing murmur, telling him to let her take his coat, to hang it in the fine, large wardrobe. He stumbled as he moved toward it, his vision swimming. Bridget guided him gently, her grip surprisingly firm, steering him directly into the wardrobe's open interior. The last thing Percival Hargreaves consciously perceived was the clean, sharp scent of cedar, followed by a soft click, and then a sudden, profound plunge into cold, absolute darkness and the smell of damp earth. A lantern, hanging from a hook just inside the hidden chamber, was uncovered by Nuala, who had been waiting in the suffocating blackness. Its swinging light threw grotesque, elongated shadows against the earthen walls as she and Bridget went about their work with a practiced, silent efficiency. 2 weeks later, the same sequence was repeated with Lionel Crane. He was an assayer from a boomtown to the north, a man who converted raw gold and silver into cash. He was rumored to work for himself, a freelancer who asked few questions and kept meticulous records only for his own purposes. He was solitary by nature and by trade, a man who carried the wealth of others in reinforced saddlebags and trusted no one. He was wary, but he was also a creature of habit, and he appreciated good whiskey. He stayed at the Golden Kiln for a single night, intending to leave before dawn. He made the mistake of boasting to Bridget about the purity of a recent batch of gold he was transporting, even allowing her a glimpse of the heavy canvas sacks. His caution was eroded by Bridget's disarming conversation and the warmth of the saloon. He, too, was offered a special vintage, and he, too, found himself walking a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity, his boots feeling as if they were made of lead. He never checked out. His horse was found a week later, still saddled, wandering a dozen miles to the south. Of Lionel Crane, there was no trace. The profits from these transactions were recorded with chilling dispassion in a ledger kept by Nuala. It was a thick, high-quality book, its cover bound in dark green leather. Inside, Nuala's handwriting was a model of clarity and precision, her numbers arranged in neat, orderly columns. But the language she used was a private code that transformed murder into commerce. The victims were never referred to by name. They were listed as stock. Each entry began with an acquisition date. Subsequent columns were headed with terms like consumables, which noted the cost of the whiskey and the laudanum used. The primary entry was labeled yield, with subcolumns for specie, paper, and goods. Under the entry for Percival Hargreaves, the yield was noted as a very specific amount in gold coin and banknotes, followed by a list under goods that included a gold pocket watch, a silver map case, and a leather satchel. Lionel Crane's entry was simpler, noting only a substantial yield in gold dust and the notation, saddlebags. 2. The ledger was a perfect record of their operation, a testament to its profitability and a complete abstraction of the violence at its core. It was the account book of a slaughterhouse. Reading its pages, one could begin to question if the accumulation of wealth was the sole motive, or if the true satisfaction lay in the perfect, repeatable execution of the system itself, the thrill of a flawlessly balanced sheet at the end of a grim equation. This string of disappearances, while unnoticed by the territory at large, began to form a pattern for one man. Deputy Conrad Hale was young, and unlike his superior, Sheriff Pike, he possessed a restless and inquisitive mind. He had been a clerk in a law office back east before coming west for his health, and he had a deep-seated respect for paperwork and the stories it could tell. It was his job to log missing persons inquiries, however informal. When a concerned partner of Lionel Crane sent a telegram asking after the assayer's whereabouts, Hale began to connect it to a similar, unanswered query that had come from a railroad office regarding Percival Hargreaves. In both cases, the last known location of the missing man was Red Hollow, specifically the Golden Kiln. Hale paid a visit to the roadhouse, where Bridget met his questions with an open and helpful demeanor. She remembered both men distinctly. She told him that Mr. Hargreaves had left quite early one morning, saying he had business to the east. She recalled that Mr. Crane had settled his bill in the middle of the night, explaining that he preferred to travel in the cool darkness. Her stories were plausible and delivered with an unshakable sincerity. But to Deputy Hale, they were too neat. Two different men, both carrying significant assets, both deciding to depart at odd hours without waiting for the stage or traveling with a freight caravan for safety. It felt wrong. He took his concerns to Sheriff Pike, laying out the timeline and the coincidences. The sheriff listened with an air of paternalistic impatience. He reminded his deputy that they lived in a vast and dangerous territory. Men went missing all the time for 100 different reasons. They could get lost. Their horses could go lame. They could fall victim to bandits on the open trail. He pointed out that the O'Hara sisters ran the most respectable establishment in the county and were generous contributors to the community. He asked Conrad if he had any actual evidence of wrongdoing, or just a series of unfortunate coincidences. When the deputy admitted he had no hard proof, the sheriff told him to drop it. He said that harassing honest businesswomen with vague suspicions was not their job. He reminded Hale that their duty was to keep the peace in Red Hollow, and the Golden Kiln was a cornerstone of that peace. The conversation was a clear, if unspoken, order. The inquiry was closed. Deputy Hale was leashed, but his suspicions were not extinguished. They smoldered, waiting for a draft of air, a flicker of new evidence that might one day be fanned into a flame. For now, however, the machine behind the wardrobe continued its silent, methodical work, and the secrets of the O'Hara sisters remained safely buried in the cold, dark earth. For nearly a year, the hidden machinery of the Golden Kiln operated with the flawless precision of a well-oiled clock. The desert swallowed the secrets the sisters fed it, and the rhythm of Red Hollow continued undisturbed. Men arrived, some stayed, some left, and some simply vanished. Their disappearances were attributed to the vast and indifferent dangers of the territory, becoming anecdotal tragedies told over whiskey at the very bar where their fates had been sealed. The sisters' reputation for propriety and civility grew, a thick varnish of respectability that protected the rotten wood beneath. But the desert, for all its capacity for concealment, is a landscape of sudden and violent change. Secrets buried in sand are not buried forever. A single storm, a shift in the wind, can expose what was meant to be permanently hidden. The undoing of the O'Hara sisters began not with a confession or a clever piece of detective work, but with an act of God. In the late summer of 1873, the sky, which for months had been a sheet of seamless, searing blue, turned the color of a fresh bruise. Clouds boiled up over the distant mountains, their bellies dark and heavy. The air grew thick and still, the oppressive silence of an indrawn breath. Then the rain came. It was not a gentle, life-giving shower, but a biblical deluge, a solid wall of water that struck the hard, baked earth with the force of 1,000 hammers. The dry wash behind the Golden Kiln, a place of dust and lizards for most of the year, was transformed in minutes into a raging, chocolate-brown river. The flash flood tore through the shallow channel, its turbulent waters ripping at the sandy banks, scouring away months of accumulated soil and debris. The torrent raged for less than an hour, And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The sun re-emerged, steaming the damp earth, and the wash returned to a placid trickle, its course irrevocably altered. 2 days later, Otto Weiss guided his freight wagon into Red Hollow. As his mules drank from the trough, he walked toward the back of the settlement to relieve himself, making his way to the edge of the newly carved wash. The flood had exposed a fresh, steep bank of earth directly behind the O'Hara's roadhouse. Something white, half buried in the damp sand near the bottom of the cut, caught his eye. He assumed it was a piece of sun-bleached animal bone, a common sight in the desert. But as he drew closer, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. The shape was familiar. It was the curved, articulated form of a human radius bone, and just above it, protruding from the sand, were the clear outlines of several phalanges, the bones of a hand. Otto was a simple man who wanted nothing more than to haul his cargo, collect his pay, and be left alone. He stared at the bone for a long moment, the desert silence pressing in on him. He considered turning around, walking away, and forgetting what he had seen. It was the easy path, the safe path. But the image of that pale, skeletal hand reaching from the earth was too stark, too obscene to ignore. He turned, not back toward his wagon, but toward the small plank building that served as the sheriff's office. He had seen something he wished he had not, and now the burden of that knowledge was no longer his alone to carry. Otto's discovery was a crack in the dam of silence, and through it, other trickles of suspicion began to flow, coalescing into a current of quiet dread. His report, delivered in a low, hesitant voice to Deputy Conrad Hale, provided a physical anchor for the young lawman's long-held unease. While the sheriff dismissed it as likely being an old pioneer grave or a tribal burial disturbed by the flood, Deputy Hale saw it as the first tangible piece of a puzzle he had been turning over in his mind for months. Armed with this new, grim evidence, he began to ask questions again, but this time he did not start at the Golden Kiln. He started at the general store, a place of gossip and meticulous record-keeping, run by a woman named Beatrice Lorne. Beatrice was a widow in her 50s, a pragmatic and observant woman who saw everything that happened in Red Hollow. She had a healthy respect for the O'Hara sisters as customers. They paid in cash and never argued about prices, but she had also noted the oddity of their purchases. At Deputy Hale's gentle prompting, Beatrice consulted her sales ledgers. She confirmed that the sisters bought the expected supplies for a roadhouse: flour, salt, pork, coffee, and vast quantities of sugar for their baking. But there were other, recurring purchases that seemed out of place. Nuala O'Hara, who always handled the procurement of supplies, would often come to the store late in the evening, just before closing time. It was during these late-night visits that she would buy the unusual items. Beatrice's records showed that Nuala purchased coal oil in quantities that far exceeded what would be needed for their lamps. She was also a regular buyer of lye, a caustic substance used for soap making, but in amounts that would supply a commercial laundry, not a small roadhouse. And then there was the rope. Nuala frequently bought lengths of heavy, durable rope. When Beatrice had once innocently inquired what they needed so much rope for, Nuala had given a vague and unsatisfying answer about securing loose shutters and bundling firewood. Looking at the entries now, laid out in the stark black ink of her ledger, Beatrice felt a chill. The combination of items, purchased late at night by the silent, withdrawn sister, painted a picture not of household management, but of something industrial, something that required fuel, a powerful dissolving agent, and strong bindings. Deputy Hale's next visit was to Dr. Jasper Rook. The doctor was a man of science and education, a refugee from the crowded, disease-ridden cities of the East. He had come west seeking clean air and a quiet life, serving as the only physician within a 100-mile radius. He was a methodical, private man who trusted empirical evidence above all else. Under the pretense of a formal inquiry into the discovered remains, Hale and the doctor, accompanied by Otto Weiss, went to the wash with lanterns as dusk settled over the desert. The wind had begun to pick up, whining through the sparse cane grass at the water's edge, a low, mournful sound that set the men's teeth on edge. They found the bone Otto had spotted, and with careful digging, they unearthed more. It was not a full skeleton, but a collection of fragments. Dr. Rook worked by the swinging lantern light, his face a mask of concentration. He placed the recovered pieces on a clean canvas sheet, his touch gentle and precise. Later that night, in the privacy of his small infirmary, which smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs, Dr. Rook examined the fragments more closely. He confirmed they were human, but he found something else, something that he would not mention in his official report to Sheriff Pike, but which he noted in his private, leather-bound journal. On a fragment of a tibia, and again on a piece of a rib, he found a series of faint, parallel abrasions. He studied them under a magnifying glass. They were scrape marks, scored deep into the bone. And more chillingly, around the articulated joint of a wrist bone, he observed a distinct and unnatural pattern of discoloration, a faint, dark stain that suggested the long-term application of a binding. In his journal, by the light of a single oil lamp, he wrote a few terse, chilling sentences. He described the remains as being from at least 2 different individuals. He noted the evidence of dismemberment, the tool marks on the bones inconsistent with animal predation. And he concluded with the most damning observation of all, writing of undeniable proof of bindings, of ligatures tied with such force and for such a duration that they had left their ghostly signature on the very bone itself. With the town's stomach beginning to turn, the moral authorities of Red Hollow found themselves on uncertain ground. Reverend Malachi Doone, who had once been the sisters' most vocal supporter, was now assailed by doubt. The stories of missing men, which he had dismissed as tragic but unrelated incidents, now seemed to form a sinister constellation around the Golden Kiln. The talk of Beatrice Lorne's ledgers and the grim findings in the wash had reached him, and his faith in the sisters' piety was shaken to its foundation. He recalled Bridget's smooth, convincing words, her generous donations, and he felt a profound sense of spiritual unease. He began to question if he had been merely a fool, or something worse, a shield his good name and holy office used to provide cover for an unimaginable evil. His sermons became darker, filled with allusions to wolves in sheep's clothing and the deceptive nature of worldly appearances. He no longer took his supper at the roadhouse. Sheriff Calvin Pike found himself in a far more compromised position. He was a man cornered by his own willful inaction and by the quiet debts he had incurred. Bridget's monthly donations had become a comfortable and necessary supplement to his meager official salary. To act now would be to admit his own negligence, his failure to heed his deputy's earlier warnings. It would also, he knew, bring an immediate end to the discreet flow of cash that paid for his better quality boots and the top-shelf whiskey he enjoyed. When Deputy Hale presented him with Dr. Rook's carefully worded official report, which omitted the most gruesome speculations but confirmed the human nature of the remains, the sheriff hesitated. He spoke of the need for more concrete proof, for a witness, for anything that directly tied the bones in the wash to the O'Hara sisters. He stalled, prevaricated, and deflected, his authority visibly eroding with every excuse. But the tide of public opinion in a small, isolated community like Red Hollow is a powerful force. The rumors were no longer whispers. They were a low, steady roar. The question was no longer whether the O'Hara sisters were what they seemed. The question, now hanging in the tense, watchful air, was what the town was going to do about it. The evidence was at hand, fragmented but damning. The time for looking away was over. The fragile peace that Sheriff Pike had fought so hard to maintain, a peace built on denial and quiet complicity, shattered just after midnight. The simmering fear and suspicion that had gripped Red Hollow finally boiled over into a raw, uncontainable fury. The catalyst was not a piece of new evidence, but the simple, terrifying realization that the community had been sleeping next to a viper's nest. The men of the town, their faces grim in the flickering torchlight, gathered in front of the livery. They were not a mob in the traditional sense. There was no wild, chaotic shouting. They were a posse, a grim and determined body of men who had reached a collective, unspoken consensus. They carried lanterns, shotguns, and a heavy, righteous anger that was more dangerous than any simple bloodlust. They were freighters, blacksmiths, and prospectors, men accustomed to hard work and direct action, and they had decided that if the law would not act, they would. Deputy Conrad Hale stood with them, not as a leader egging them on, but as a man trying to steer an avalanche. He had seen the mood of the town shift throughout the day, the quiet conversations in the general store, the way men looked toward the golden kiln with a new, hardened expression. He had tried one last time to compel Sheriff Pike to issue a warrant, to conduct a formal search of the premises, but the sheriff had locked himself in his office, claiming he needed a directive from the territorial judge. Hale knew this was a lie, a final, desperate attempt to avoid the inevitable. Seeing the determined faces of the townsmen, Hale realized the choice was no longer between action and inaction. It was between organized, lawful entry and a bloody, chaotic siege. He made his decision. He would deputize the men on the spot, giving their actions the thin but necessary veneer of legality. He held up a hand, his voice steady in the tense silence, and declared them all agents of the county, their purpose to serve a warrant of investigation on the proprietors of the Golden Kiln. It was a fiction, but a necessary one. Sheriff Pike arrived late, drawn from his office by the sight of the torch-wielding procession moving down the single dusty street. He was a man adrift, his authority utterly gone, supplanted by the raw will of the populace. He stumbled alongside the group, his protests feeble and unheard, a pathetic, irrelevant figure swept along by a tide of public fury he could no longer control. The men ignored him. Their focus was entirely on the roadhouse, which stood silent and dark at the end of the street, its windows like vacant eyes in the moonlight. The usual warm lamplight was gone. The fiddle was silent. It was as if the building itself knew what was coming and had pulled into its shell. Deputy Hale, with Dr. Rook and Otto Weiss at his side, mounted the steps of the porch. He hammered on the heavy oak door, the sound unnaturally loud in the night air. He announced his name and his office, demanding entry in the name of the law. There was no reply. The silence from within was absolute, a heavy, listening stillness that was more unnerving than any shouted defiance. After a second, louder demand went unanswered. The town blacksmith stepped forward with a heavy sledgehammer, and with 3 deafening blows, splintered the door frame and forced it inward. The interior of the saloon was a void of darkness and shadow. The air was thick with the cloying, sweet smell of cheap perfume and the acrid tang of fear. As the townsmen poured in, their lanterns and torches casting a chaotic, dancing light, they found the room in a state of bizarre disarray. Tables were overturned, chairs were smashed, and the polished bar was scarred with deep gouges. Behind the bar, the source of the chaos became clear. 2 large illicit stills, which had been secretly producing the kiln's cheap whiskey in the deep cellar, had been hastily dragged upstairs and kicked over. Their contents, a high-proof, unaged spirit, had gushed across the floorboards, creating a treacherous, invisible lake of flammable liquid. Suddenly, a single gunshot erupted from the top of the stairs. The bullet splintered the wood of the bar, sending the men diving for cover. It was followed by a woman's voice, cold and sharp, warning them to come no further. It was Bridget. A second shot rang out, this one from a different position, deeper within the building. It was Nuala, providing covering fire while Bridget made her stand. The townsmen, no strangers to violence, returned fire. The saloon, once a place of raucous camaraderie, became a kill zone. Heavy lead slugs tore through the darkness, shattering the remaining bottles behind the bar and punching holes in the adobe walls. In the midst of the chaos, a lantern was dropped, its glass chimney shattering on the whiskey-soaked floor. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. A wave of blue fire raced across the room with a terrifying whoosh, a silent, beautiful, and utterly deadly inferno. The flames climbed the walls, igniting the curtains and the dry wooden furniture. The air became a searing, unbreathable miasma of smoke and alcohol fumes. The ceiling joists above began to pop and groan in the intense heat, the sound like pistol shots. The fire changed the calculus of the fight. The siege had become a desperate race against time. Through the swirling black smoke, Deputy Hale saw Bridget descending the stairs, her hands raised in surrender. Her face was smudged with soot, but her expression was one of defiant calm. She was not panicking. She was stalling. It was a calculated sacrifice, a final, tactical move in a game she had just lost. As the townsmen's attention focused on taking her into custody, on dragging her out of the burning building before it collapsed, Nuala made her escape. She had never been on the stairs. Her gunshot had come from the rear corridor. While Bridget drew the focus of the raid, Nuala had retreated to the windowless room, slipped into the massive wardrobe, and disappeared into the hidden passage behind it. She fled into the earthen chamber, out through the grate into the darkness of the wash, and then into the vast, anonymous sanctuary of the desert, leaving her sister to face the consequences of their shared enterprise. Deputy Hale, his lungs burning, saw the open door to the rear corridor and sensed Bridget's gambit. Leaving her in the custody of the other men, he plunged into the smoke-filled hallway, his gut telling him that the true heart of the mystery lay back here. He kicked open the door to the last room and was met with a scene from a nightmare. The room was untouched by the fire, but filled with the evidence of a dozen murders. The great wardrobe stood open, its false back swung inward, revealing the dark, earthen passage beyond. And disgorged from that hidden chamber, pulled out in a desperate last-minute attempt to destroy evidence, was a horde of personal effects that told the story the sisters had tried so hard to conceal. A pile of men's clothing lay in a heap. On the floor were scattered the mundane, intimate possessions of the dead. There was Percival Hargreaves's silver map case, its surface dented, and a stack of his railroad deeds. There was Lionel Crane's set of assayer's scales, still in their velvet-lined box. There were pocket watches, their chains tangled together like metallic vines. There were wallets, emptied of cash but still containing faded photographs of wives and children. Most damning of all was a small, locked metal box. Using the butt of his pistol, Hale smashed the lock. Inside, he found a collection of letters written in different hands, but all signed by men who had long since vanished. They were letters of reassurance to families and business partners, letters with forged signatures, posted from distant towns to create the illusion that the men were still alive, that their journeys were continuing. It was a library of lies, the final, meticulous piece of the sisters' ghastly machine. The heat from the main saloon was becoming unbearable, the roar of the fire a deafening monster. Hale grabbed the box of letters and as much of the other evidence as he could carry and retreated, stumbling out of the burning building just as its roof finally gave way, collapsing inward in a volcanic eruption of sparks and flame. The golden kiln, the beacon of light that had drawn so many to their doom, went dark forever, its secrets now exposed in the stark, unforgiving light of its own destruction. Justice had come to Red Hollow, but it was a chaotic, fire-scorched justice, and one of the guilty parties had already been swallowed by the night. The fire that consumed the golden kiln burned until dawn, a furious orange pyre against the deep indigo of the pre-dawn sky. By sunrise, all that remained was a blackened, smoking footprint, a rectangular scar on the desert floor. The thick adobe walls, which had been built with such meticulous, fortress-like care, had crumbled inward, burying the secrets of the cellar under tons of superheated earth and charred timber. The fire was an act of purification and of erasure. It had exposed the sisters' crimes, but it had also cauterized the wound, leaving a clean, sterile ruin where a monument to depravity had once stood. The grim story, however, was far from over. Its tendrils would now reach from the desolate outpost of Red Hollow into the formal halls of territorial justice, and its echoes would linger in the archives of history, waiting for a patient hand to uncover the final, chilling details. Bridget O'Hara was transported to Carson City for trial. The journey itself was a spectacle. She sat shackled in the back of a prison wagon, her face a mask of indifference as they passed through the small mining camps and settlements that dotted the trail. Word of the events at Red Hollow had traveled faster than the wagon, and at every stop, small crowds would gather to stare at the woman who had become known as the Siren of the Sagebrush. They saw not a monster, but a handsome, well-dressed woman who met their gazes with an unnerving, unblinking calm. There was no sign of remorse, no flicker of fear. She was an object of terrifying composure, a puzzle that no one could solve. The trial became the sensation of the territory. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, miners, and society women, all craning their necks to get a look at the defendant. The prosecution, led by a young and ambitious territorial attorney, built its case on the mountain of physical evidence that Deputy Conrad Hale had rescued from the flames. The courtroom fell silent as Hale, his testimony delivered in a clear and steady voice, identified each object. He held up the tarnished silver map case of Percival Hargreaves. He opened the velvet-lined box containing Lionel Crane's delicate assayer's scales. He unspooled the tangled mass of pocket watches, their silent hands a testament to the lives they had once measured. The most powerful evidence was the box of forged letters. Handwriting experts testified that the signatures were clever but ultimately clumsy forgeries, and postal clerks from 2 different states provided sworn affidavits that the letters had been mailed from their offices by a woman matching Bridget's description. The testimony of the Red Hollow residents painted a damning picture of the sisters' methods. Otto Weiss recounted his grim discovery in the wash. Beatrice Lorne read from her ledgers, her voice trembling slightly as she listed the late-night purchases of lye and rope. Dr. Jasper Rook, presenting his findings with clinical precision, spoke of the tool marks on the bone fragments and the undeniable evidence of bindings. Throughout the proceedings, Bridget remained a silent, immutable presence. She refused to take the stand in her own defense. She refused to answer any questions about her sister, Nuala. Her court-appointed lawyer, a man overwhelmed by the evidence against his client, could do little more than raise procedural objections. Bridget seemed to view the entire affair with a kind of detached academic interest, as if she were a naturalist observing a peculiar and somewhat tedious ritual. When the jury returned its verdict of guilty on multiple counts of murder and robbery, a verdict reached in less than an hour, her expression did not change. When the judge, his voice heavy with condemnation, sentenced her to death by hanging, she simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a foregone conclusion. She never spoke her sister's name. She never gave the authorities a single clue as to where Nuala might have gone. Her silence was her final act of control, a wall behind which her sister could make her escape. Bridget went to the gallows 2 months later, her composure intact to the very last moment. Of Nuala O'Hara, there was only silence and speculation. She had vanished into the desert as if she were a spirit of the landscape itself. The manhunt that followed the fire was extensive but ultimately futile. Posses fanned out from Red Hollow, following tracks that inevitably disappeared on the hard, sun-baked plains of rock and gravel that separated Nevada from the lawless territories to the south. For years, her ghost would surface in rumors and unconfirmed sightings. A freighter claimed to have shared a meal with a quiet, dark-haired woman in a dusty cantina in Sonora, a woman who paid for her food with a gold coin of unusual purity and never spoke a word. A ship's captain out of Guaymas told a story of a female passenger who booked passage to Panama under a false name, a solitary woman who spent the entire voyage in her cabin and left the ship before the authorities could check the passenger manifest. These were just stories, whispers on the wind. Nuala became a legend, a cautionary tale told around campfires. She was the one who got away, the colder, smarter sister who had dissolved back into the wilderness that had produced her. She was the unbalanced line in the ledger, the final, terrifying proof that in a landscape vast enough, some accounts are never settled. The scandal of the Golden Kiln had its own casualties among the living. Sheriff Calvin Pike resigned his office in disgrace less than a week after the fire. He was never charged with a crime, but his complicity was understood by everyone. The quiet scandal of his unexplained debts, the donations he had so readily accepted, clung to him like the alkali dust. He left Red Hollow in the middle of the night, his reputation in ruins, a man broken by his own willful blindness. Deputy Conrad Hale was promoted to sheriff in his place, but he did not hold the position for long. The grim events had soured him on the territory, and he eventually moved back east, his brief, violent career in Western law enforcement a memory he rarely spoke of. He had done his duty, but he had seen a darkness in Red Hollow that he could not unsee. Red Hollow itself began to die. The destruction of its primary commercial enterprise was a blow from which it never recovered. The freight trail that was its lifeblood was rendered obsolete when the railroad finally pushed its tracks through a pass 30 miles to the north. The small mines played out, their veins of silver and gold turning to worthless quartz. People drifted away, seeking their fortunes elsewhere, until Red Hollow was little more than a collection of tilting, empty buildings, their windows like the vacant eyes of skulls. The desert began the slow, patient work of reclamation. Wind and sand scoured the paint from the wood, and the relentless sun bleached the lumber to a silver gray. Roofs collapsed, walls fell. The foundations of the Golden Kiln, the last remaining trace of the O'Hara sisters' bloody enterprise, were slowly buried, becoming just another enigmatic shape in the sand, ringed by the stubborn, dark green of creosote bushes. Decades passed. The story of the O'Hara sisters faded from living memory into folklore, a grim footnote in the violent history of the frontier. Then, in 1936, during the height of the Great Depression, the story was resurrected by an unlikely source. Dr. Beatrice Rowe, a historian working for the Works Progress Administration, was conducting a survey of abandoned 19th century settlements in the region. Her project was to map and document these ghost towns before they disappeared completely. She came to the site of Red Hollow with her maps, her measuring tools, and a small team of workers. She identified the faint outlines of the livery and the general store, and the solid, rectangular foundation of what her research indicated was once a roadhouse called the Golden Kiln. During the excavation of the roadhouse foundation, one of her workers struck something hard and metallic beneath the heavy, flat stones of what had once been the hearth. It was a heavy, iron strongbox, its surface deeply pitted with rust. It had been cleverly hidden in a false bottom beneath the firebox, a place of last resort for valuables that needed to survive a fire. With great difficulty, they pried the lid open. Inside, protected from the elements by a thick wrapping of oilcloth, was a single, perfectly preserved leather-bound ledger. It was Nuala's secret account book, the one she had not had time to retrieve or destroy in the chaos of the fire. Dr. Rowe, a woman accustomed to the dry, impersonal language of historical documents, felt a profound chill as she turned its pages. She saw the columns marked stock, yield, and goods. She saw the coded language that transformed human beings into commodities. She painstakingly cross-referenced the dates of acquisition with old missing persons reports from territorial archives, and a cold, perfect correlation emerged. The ledger was the final, irrefutable confession, a document of pure, methodical evil. It answered the lingering question of motive. This was not just murder for money. This was a business, run with a ruthless, psychopathic efficiency that was utterly terrifying in its clarity. The ledger was the final word from the ruins, a voice from the dust that confirmed the darkest suspicions and solidified a local ghost story into a documented historical nightmare. The grim tale of the O'Hara sisters was now complete, its final chapter written not in a courtroom, but in the precise, cold hand of the sister who had vanished into the desert, leaving behind only the chilling mathematics of her crimes. The record on the O'Hara sisters is now complete, and your presence through its final page is a valued part of our work. If you have just found this archive, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to ensure you are here when the next file is unsealed, and share with us in the comments how this story has settled in your mind.